Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we've built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. Over the past 13 years, we have worked with life science companies from across the globe, helping them with everything from creating virtual advisory boards to medical education programs to medical publication teams, investigator groups, and all kinds of things. And since the launch of our award-winning Insight Events platform, we've been helping these same companies with virtual sales training events, hackathons, MSL events, and everything in between. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations that we have with some of the leading edge thinkers, the digital provocateurs, the leading edge entrepreneurs, is we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm really super thrilled to having one of these thought leaders at the table with me today. This is Jennifer Helfer. She's passionate about meaningfully engaging patient communities to improve therapeutic development and the delivery of healthcare. Jennifer is doing this by developing mutual understanding between stakeholders, as well as driving collaborations around shared goals. Jen has a strong background in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as patient advocacy nonprofits and bench research. Currently, Jen is the Senior Director of Patient Advocacy and Engagement at a company called Encoded Therapeutics. It's a gene regulation therapy biotech company that's focused on pediatric CNS diseases. And prior to joining Encoded, she was the Senior Director of Client Services at Voz Advisors, Director and Global Lead of Patient Advocacy at Bluebird Bio, and Associate Director of Scientific Operations at the National Brain Tumor Society. Before finding her passion in advocacy, Jen engaged in basic research at Boston University's Medical Center as a postdoctoral fellow. Jen received a BA in psychology from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, an MA in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Delaware, and a PhD in biology neuroscience from the University of Victoria. So happy to have you, Jennifer. So thank you for joining our show today.
Yeah, thank you for that great introduction. And thank you to both you and Impetus Digital for inviting me to be part of today. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Absolutely. I'm also super thrilled. And, I know this shouldn't come to a surprise because we have so many women in STEM nowadays, and it's super exciting to see that, but it hasn't always been the case. You have had this very strong background in science, and you're, in this really leading edge biotech company. Tell us a little bit about what drove you there. Were you always interested in science, for other people to be inspired by your career trajectory?
Yeah, well, I will say I always thought science was cool. I had really great teachers early on who made science fun. And I think the other piece that really got me into wanting to go into a career of especially within neuroscience with that focus, was my grandmother was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease towards the end of my high school years. And so that really drove me one into psychology, but then more into the biology side and medicine. And so I think that's what just put me on my trajectory.
Absolutely love it, and good for you. And it's so it's so great to see you on this side as well too. So you work for a great company, Encoded Therapeutics, a small, interesting biotech company. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, so you mentioned Encoded Small. We're a small biotech that's based in South San Francisco, and I know you used to work in the South San Francisco area. And we're privately owned small biotech that's working to develop one-time precision gene therapies for CNS disorders. And we're relatively young, and that's why we're small. We were founded in 2014, and we're on track to initiate our first investigational clinical trial this year. So it's a really big, momentous time period for us. And I think to answer your question, kind of what are we doing? We're in this era of precision medicine, but although we're here, it's still an emerging field. And there's still far too many individuals living with genetic disorders whose current treatment regimens only focus on the symptoms and don't really address the underlying cause of that disease. So for many, this means frequent treatment, lots of medication, lifelong management, and just a benefit that's actually minimal to what they would hope for. So with this era of precision medicine and the recent technological advances, the transformational change is possible. And that's what Encoded's trying to do.
Absolutely thrilling. And it's so great to see this. So let's actually take a step back for people just to get an understanding of this new world of genetics. Many of us have heard of 23andMe. It's kind of like the basic thing. It's like this liquid biopsy that you basically, do a swab and, off it goes and suddenly you get your genetics, and we continue to keep getting our reports, and this is all great. But there's got to be more to it than that. There's more legs to it. Tell us a little bit about Encoded Therapeutics kind of mission around genetics or genetic testing or genome testing.
Yeah, so we don't ourselves do genome testing or genetic testing. We do support some efforts that do that, especially early on, because that will help prognosis. That diagnosis through genetic testing will help prognosis and care for individuals that live with these genetic disorders. What Encoded's focusing on is developing gene therapies, specifically that target these genetic causes of the diseases. And so the way we're doing this is we have some really smart scientists who are working to overcome some of the limitations of the current technologies specific to gene therapies. And they're doing this by employing our cell-selective targeting and regulation platform. And this, as I mentioned, this enables us to overcome some of those limitations by being able to target select cells instead of broadly hitting multiple types of cells, but also getting around some of the limitations, packaging limitations, specifically around some of the vectors that are used to deliver these medicines.
So this is really interesting. So let's just isolate, for example, cancer for a minute. And we've know the old ways that we're doing, not that long ago, even 20 years ago, before, for example, Genentech came in and started targeting. So this was before these chemical entities that you'd sort of spray and pray and then hope that something got killed in the way. And then while you were doing it, everything else died in the process, including your healthy tissues. So what you're suggesting here now is by really uber focusing on genetics, is you might be able to find where some of these mutations and other sorts of issues, and that you can create medications that are going to be targeting those variants. Is that kind of what the thinking is behind the technologies at Encoded?
Yeah, I think you're right on. And I think when you say the medicines that we're creating, it's actually almost genetic codes in themselves is the medicine. So it's introducing different genetic codes into the body that are going to overcome some of the limitations of the genetic deficits from these, which are causing these disorders. So I think, to give an example, Dravet syndrome, that's Encoded's lead indication. It's what we're hoping to start our first clinical trial in this by the end of this year. So here, the gene of interest is SCN1A. And this gene, in people who are living with Dravet syndrome, it's about 80 to 85% of these people have a mutation in this gene. And so think about it, everybody has 2 copies of a gene. And in Dravet syndrome, only one of these copies works. So there's a mutation in one copy, but there's a working copy. And for everybody else who's not living with Dravet, they have 2 working copies. Now, to potentially treat Dravet syndrome, what we're doing is we're using an adeno-associated viral vector. And this is specifically an AAV9 vector that's really good at getting into brain cells and has not been shown to cause disease in people. So what we're doing is we're taking this delivery system, this vector, and inside of it, we're packaging information that is going to instruct the cell or that working copy of the gene that the individual still has to upregulate the action of that gene, to therefore overcome the deficit from the non-working copy. Additionally, what's packaged into this vector is a regulatory element that allows for select targeting, and in our case, specifically GABAergic interneurons in the brain, because this is where the cause of the disease is associated with when you have basically a reduction in the activity of these GABAergic inhibitory neurons. What happens in Dravet is the brain gets overexcited because you don't have this inhibition. And this leads to seizures, significant cognitive delays, profound behavioral difficulties, sleep abnormalities, and a host of other things. So again, what we're doing is we're delivering basically a regulatory element that tells the working copy to work harder, produce more, and hopefully this will then overcome the deficit from that non-working copy. Now, I do want to be transparent. This is all experimental. This, we do need to test this in clinical studies, and that's what we're hoping to start at the end of this year. But again, the hope here is that not only are we going to restore the balance, this inhibitory excitatory balance in the brain, but then this will treat both seizures, but also all the other manifestations that come with Dravet.
So you are going to be launching this study. It's a preclinical study called Envision this year. Can you tell us a little bit about what that study is all about?
Yeah, so Envision is actually our natural history study that we've already launched. So a natural history study means there's no therapeutic or new therapeutic given to the individual. What it is, it's basically observational. We're looking at individuals who have joined or participated in the trial, looking at their disease trajectory over a number of years. And it's really just to better understand Dravet syndrome from a clinical perspective. Our Endeavor, which is the name of our investigational clinical trial, that's the one we're hoping to launch by the end of this year. That's going to be looking at ETX-101, which is what we're calling our gene regulation therapy for Dravet. And so what we're hoping this will do is, through the clinical trial, we'll be able to test both safety and efficacy of this gene regulation therapy. And ideally, as I mentioned, we'll be able to treat both seizures, but also other manifestations of Dravet syndrome.
So just out of curiosity, this is considered a rare disorder, right? So pharma used to be, or biotech companies used to always be chasing after the big kahuna, the big splashy ones in diabetes and cardiovascular, but everything's kind of been found, and most things are sort of like an slight improvement, and it's kind of difficult to capture the value. So the new thing in the last 10 years, and last 10 to 15 years, is being able to go after some of these more niche markets, so rare diseases. Tell us a little bit about how Encoded decided to go after this particular abnormality. Was it, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it the disease that came first, or was it the vector and said, hey, this works in Dravet syndrome?
I think it kind of came together around the same time. I don't know all the details, unfortunately, so I don't want to speak to anything incorrectly. But it really was, from my understanding, our co-founders were really interested in taking that next step and figuring out ways that we could treat these genetic disorders that are out there and overcoming the limitations that currently exist with our current technologies. And that's where they came up with this really cool science, that helps us really target select cells, and also this regulation platform that overcomes the packaging issue that some of these AAVs have, and other vectors have too. So I think it all came together, though. Dravet is, CNS, I mentioned we use an AAV9 vector, and that is a vector that's, as I mentioned, really good at getting into brain cells. So they were looking at CNS and looking at what diseases have very large unmet need and could really benefit from this new technology.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
So in terms of this study, tell us a little bit about the clinical trial design and who is eligible for that study. Because again, this is a rare disorder. I'm curious about the numbers of people that you're looking at, in the US or otherwise. And so how are you planning to capture patients for this clinical study?
Yeah, so I will say we haven't finalized the design yet. So I can't share too much because things are still changing every day. But, I think to your point, for, where are these patients and how are we finding them? Right now, for our current natural history study, the one that is ongoing right now, we are running that in the US, the UK, and Australia. So we are going, outside of just the US at this time point. Hopefully we'll be able to do that with, our future studies too. I think with any gene therapy study, especially when you're entering into phase 1, it's usually very small. You're really looking for safety at this point, and even dosing. So I think for that, it might start in the US and go broader, once we have that initial piece. And also that initial piece is going to be in very few patients. Again, we want to make sure this is going to be safe before we do anything else. And so, from there, we'll see where things go. And, hopefully then we'll be able to broaden both numbers and geography in the reach.
This is a very specialized type of disease. You're talking about pediatrics. Tell us a little
Yes.
bit about why, because normally people will say, well, it has to be over 12 or over 16 for safety and precaution reasons. Tell us why you're specifically, is it just because it's a disease that targets pediatrics?
So, because it's genetic, and it is the individual's born with this mutation. Because of that, and because so much of the cause and the damage from the mutation is in the brain's really hard to fix. Once you have this damage. And so we want to start early, as early as possible. So that way we could possibly prevent all of this damage and the associated manifestations that come with the disease. So that's why we want to start in the pediatrics or that young age. Now, there are individuals living with Dravet syndrome who are in their 40s and 50s. And so, this isn't to say that we at some point may not, at some point, we hope to be able to try, and test these type of therapies in older individuals also. But I think we need to, better understand the disease, especially in those older individuals, but also understand what benefit can we bring. If we can't rewire the brain and fix some of the damage, what benefit will this bring to these individuals?
Yeah, 100%. It's such an interesting area. And working. So what is the standard of care today? So when you eventually get past sort of the initial safety studies and what have you, what would you inevitably be comparing this type of genetic vector against?
Yeah, so in Dravet, there's I will say it's been a really exciting time for this community. The last 10 years, many new drugs have come to market or have come into clinical trials. There's quite a few clinical trials being run right now in this space. The majority of them, though, do only target and the symptom management, and specifically symptom management of the seizures. And so I think this is where those, disease-modifying therapies that we're trying to do are so important, because we can go after not just the seizures, but we're targeting the underlying cause of the disease, so then we can also hopefully prevent or treat the other manifestations.
So I really love Encoded's philosophy. It's not just going over, the very superficial kind of Band-Aid solution. You're going to the root cause. And when you get to the root cause, you can actually pull that out, and then it actually just stops whatever its prevalence is. So very,
Knock
very
on wood.
interesting. Yes. So it's
That's
all,
the
I mean, it's fantastic that people are starting to target these things that at one time were not even being diagnosed. And, here's really the other interesting thing is this a situation or condition? Because sometimes these things are very invisible. They have a myriad of manifestations, and it takes years to be able to determine what this is. And these are seizures and whatever. How difficult is it to get an actual diagnosis? And is the genetic test really the panacea to get to this diagnosis?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Just in the past few years, I think, especially with genetic testing, getting a diagnosis of Dravet has become a little bit easier for these families. Not to say it still doesn't take months to, longer, depending, on the, physician. I will say, if you're in an expert center or somewhere that's more familiar with these pediatric epilepsies, because the first sign of Dravet is seizure. So that is the first symptom onset of this. And that usually takes them to the hospital. And from there, because Dravet is so rare, they don't automatically think Dravet. They think, oh, this could be a one-off. Let's see if it happens again. So it does take some time. If you're an expert center, though, that deals with pediatric epilepsies, your route to diagnosis is a little bit faster. And I think with the onset of genetic testing, it has helped that too. Dravet, though, itself is a clinical diagnosis, and it's diagnosed through the types of seizures, EEG, what shows up on the EEG, and the genetic test actually helps confirm that. Because as I mentioned earlier, only about 80 to 85% of individuals have this genetic mutation that results in Dravet, but there's still a 10 to 15% of individuals who that's not the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Mhm.
it's nice being able to at least have that extra tool. And when you think about
Yes.
before genetic testing, it was this very abstract, there's 100 different ways that somebody can ascertain what it could possibly be. And
Mhm.
many people could just be living with these diseases and having no idea what was actually
Yes.
striking up in their health. So this
Yeah.
is a really great opportunity. So you are doing advocacy and obviously working with patients and these people who have this rare condition and who want to obviously find some sort of a treatment because there isn't one that exists today. So tell us a little bit about when you find who these people are, what is the kind of interaction that your company
Mm.
has either directly or indirectly, and is there compliance questions around that?
There's always compliance questions. I think, a lot of our outreach right now, because we're such early stages and we've been working really hard to develop and design this clinical trial, has been outreach through the advocacy organizations themselves, the Dravet organizations. And it's been outreach to them to, one, understand, the community, to understand the needs. It's also been to share what Encoded is doing or what we hope to do. And through that, we also have kicked off a program that we call Dravet Engage. And what Dravet Engage is it's initiative where we're hoping to gain insights from the community on, what parts of their disease most impacts them and impacts the family. What do they hope most for out of a clinical trial and a new therapy, especially a disease modifying therapy? And what do they think about our clinical trial design? And not just the design itself, but it's like the number of visits, the testing we're doing, the way we're tracking seizures isn't amenable to them because they're the ones who actually have to track the seizures. Is the language we're using in our informed consent documents understandable? Is the information there? So, we're working with the patient community in multiple ways. This is through ad boards, and I know you mentioned Impetus Digital does ad boards, but it's through some of that. It's also through surveys, so we can get a broader reach and understanding of the community, and the advocacy organizations have helped us put those out there. Additionally, we worked with some behavioral scientists to conduct individual interviews with some caregivers. And that was really cool to see that process and to see how they can take that insight and really turn it into useful information for us to consider as we're designing our trial.
So I'm actually just curious because these days
Yeah.
the word patient centricity has taken a completely different feeling, tone, and reality. I think especially since COVID-19, this has become extremely important. So just curious, based on your advisory boards and focus groups and one-on-one meetings and surveys, have you found that that has impacted any of your protocol or your trial design?
It definitely has. I wish I could share, as I mentioned, we're still designing, and finishing the protocol. And a month or two from now, hopefully, or in a few months, I'd be able to share a little bit of detail of how that impacted our design. So more to come. But I will say that is the important piece. You can do all of this listening, but it's only important and only impactful if you actually turn that into actions. You can't action and do everything that you hear or suggested by these individuals who are giving their time and feedback, but you do the best you can. I think some of the things that I can share is, what we worked on recently we put together a longitudinal care panel of caregivers. It's a really small group, but we're working with them over a few months time period. And one of the things we did with them was we created branding for the upcoming clinical trial. And the design, like the types of animals we're going to use, what's going to resonate with this community. And it was really cool to work with them on that process. And through that, we came up with Under the Sea. It's a sea theme. And they even helped us go through different types of Under the Sea themes. And, they were really honest. They're like, that one's too childish and this one's too serious. And they were like, that fish looks weird, but but it's like things like that really helped us hone in and work on that final design.
That's
So
fantastic that you're really
yeah.
engaging the audience and really kind of getting the market prepared, if you will, for this new trial, which is fantastic. And I love the fact that you are really focusing on the patient as part of this. So we obviously have just emerging out of this COVID-19 drama that has happened over the past 15, 16 months. And this has really completely changed the way people are doing clinical trials. We're hearing a lot about this idea, and really about doing anything for that matter. So decentralized clinical trials, hybrid trials. We're even talking about like hybrid everything. How is this being incorporated in not only patient-reported outcomes, so PROMs, patient-reported experience measures or PREMs, and how endpoints and the kinds of resilient endpoints you've decided to select based on the possibility that people are not coming in to showcase this? And a corollary to that question is, are you incorporating any sort of wearables in this as well?
Yes. So wearables is an interesting question. I'll start there. And in that is because we talked about earlier that we're going for pediatric right now, especially in Dravet. It's going to be very young individuals to start. And it's hard to put a wearable on a baby. There's a lot of issues with that, or a young child. And what we've heard from some caregivers is that there's tactile sensitivity. So if you try to put a watch or something on, they're going to rip it off. And so it's something we're still toying with and trying to figure out how can we make that doable. On your other point around some of these patient-reported outcomes, or in our case, it's more caregiver-reported outcomes, we are looking at digital tools where these, the parents or whoever the caregiver is can answer these surveys and at home. And when they answer it, it's uplinked right back to the trial site and to the trial team. Same thing with the seizure tracking. We're developing an app for them to be able to do that, in real time or in a few days, and put that information in at home and send that then to the trial site. I think the other thing that COVID really helped open up was having home visits where you actually have nurses or other individuals come to the individual's home to do study visits instead of having the family travel to the site. For this, it's been an interesting reaction when you talk to families about this. Some are like, sure, that makes our life so much easier. Let's do it. Others are like, well, the home's a safe space. We don't want poking and prodding going on at the home. We'd rather go to the clinic. Others in other disease spaces I've worked in the past, especially adolescents or even young adults who maybe have roommates. I remember one young adult was like, I don't want my roommates knowing I'm in a clinical trial. Don't come to my home. I don't want that option. So I think you have to give optionality, but I think COVID has really helped us understand what all those different options are, though.
So the clinical study sounds really interesting because unlike, for example, cardiovascular disease, where there's actual biomarkers in terms of, certain, parameters, or, diabetes, where you're looking at your blood sugar levels, there's actually something you can measure. In this particular situation, you're looking at symptomology, you're looking at outputs as in things that may not necessarily be going on in the brain. So you're looking at reducing seizures as an example, and probably other things. But is there a plan ever to go in and actually looking at the potential changes in the genetics? When you're talking about upregulating, is that going to be a concrete way to measure efficacy?
I have no idea to tell you how you go in, especially the brain in a human. I can say mouse models and, other, models. There's other ways you can do that. But the human, I know people are looking at different imaging techniques. Is there a way we can do that? But I leave that to the scientists. I left the bench years ago, and for a good reason. But it is a really good point. So much of what we're relying on is reports by the caregivers on the number of seizures, these different other patient-reported outcomes on, is the child walking and playing more? I'm simplifying it, but, those type of things, it's all visual, and there's no concrete measurements right now.
There's a lot of, and I know we're bringing up the word wearable, but there's potentially other types of sensors that can be put on. We hear a lot about the home becoming a new sort of point of care and other ways. We also hear a lot about these things called ambient biometrics, where somebody is not actually purposely, but it's just kind of happening and being measured. Is that something in the future especially for things like children, pediatrics, so this information kind of gets seamlessly entered into the data lake without a lot of personal entry?
I hope. I mean, I don't know as much about the technology and how, some of what has been shown and the hurdles or what they've been able to do with it. But I always hope, that, science is always getting better. We're always learning. We're always finding new ways to do things. And so, especially clinical trials, I hope that, we continue to innovate and we continue to look for ways to make participation as easy as possible. Because participating in a clinical trial, it takes a lot of time and it takes years. Gene therapy, it's a, potentially a 2-year study plus a long-term follow-up that's required by regulatory agencies, totaling 5 years that we're asking these families to give us their time and give us a lot of their time. So I do think we can, use different technologies to make this as easy as possible.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier about the observational study that was basically kind of global. I was just curious if you would be able to increase the chances of success and completion of your second actual trial, the next trial that's coming, the Endeavor trial, or is there regulatory issues that has to be maintained within the US? And again, I just want to preface this, if it's in the US, are you increasing the inclusion and diversity by bringing this to, because now you've got online and virtual ways of accessing patients, are you no longer just being stuck with the same traditional high volume investigators and now starting to spread your wings a little bit, being able to get to more people and maybe being able to complete the study faster and more efficiently? So just curious about the parameters of what you're looking at with the study.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, we'll probably start in the US because it's going to be a very small to start because of that efficacy and that dosing part of it. Finding dose, finding if it's safe. I said efficacy, safety, I meant. So start small. And because of that, we want to keep it to a few centers to really make sure that there's a lot of control here. And there, we've worked closely with some of these centers in the US. Through our natural history study, though, we are getting that experience and building those relationships in other countries. And so the hope is that we will, go to these other places at some point. But for now, this is a starting place. You have to start somewhere. And so this is what that is. But as soon as we are able and, we can, we do hope to be able to expand. And I think that's a huge point of, that I think about is that even if you look at our Envision study, I mentioned US, UK, and Australia, English speaking. So I think, it'd be lovely to be able to go out to other places, around the world and better understand the disease and understand if, different healthcare systems impact the disease outcourse. Not every country has the same approved drugs or access to the same drugs currently. And so does the disease have different progression, in these different places around the world? So I think there's a lot of questions I at least still have. I'm sure, and I'm not sure, but I also know that others are looking at this. And I think that's also where the collaboration in the community comes in. Not one company can do everything. And so we have to work as a community to be able to answer a lot of these questions.
Yeah, no, in a huge way. Absolutely agree. Right. So these are rare diseases. They affect a few people, and it takes a lot of time, effort, and expense for biotech companies to be able to produce these great new discoveries. At the end of the day, there's going to be a price tag associated with it. We also hear a lot about the CAR Ts and the immunotherapies and, the expense, basically the price tags on these. And the question always comes down to is who's going to pay for this? And as we continue to create these additive, high value products to very small niche audiences, is this going to bankrupt the healthcare system?
I mean, that's the $1 million question. And it really is. I think one of the ways, and I know a lot of people are working on this, this isn't my wheelhouse, I do have some experience from previous companies, going to market with gene therapies in the pricing discussions. Mostly what I worked on was working with advocacy groups, one, to help them understand different pricing models. And when I say pricing models, that's one way some folks are looking at, mitigating this bankruptcy piece. And that what if we, although it's a potential one-time therapy, what if we don't pay for it all up front? What if we split the payments up over time and it's tied to something? What if you have to show that it's still working every year for the first 5 years while you pay? That's one of the, the models that people are thinking about. But I think a lot of what others are looking at is tackling issues with manufacturing and the associated costs there. And that's one of the ways we could really bring down costs is if we can, it's still a new technology, but with any technology we've seen, after we've gotten a lot of experience with it, we've gotten really better at doing things with it. We can bring down costs and produce a lot more. So that's what we're working on. That's one way to do this. I think there's an infrastructure too. Not everybody has the infrastructure to build these type of therapies yet. So if you can build that infrastructure, that'll help bring down the cost because others will have the capacity to do that. But it's not easy. I mean, we see all the time, families going on GoFundMe, because the insurance denied their gene therapy. And you see families in other countries who only have access if they pay out of pocket because it's not technically approved there. And so they want to come to the US or another country and pay for it. And so they have to raise, upwards of $1 million for a gene therapy treatment. So it's a tough situation. But there are a lot of people working to fix this and to make it
really
better.
interesting that you're talking about these patient-reported, so these outcome-based agreements that you're talking about, and risk-sharing agreements, and all kinds of other things. And I think inevitably there's probably going to be departments in these public and private payers that are going to have to actually do some evaluations of older products and looking at sort of delisting those to add others. I mean, like you said, it's a very complex question of how to keep the healthcare system intact from a financial, and that's probably like a whole other podcast on that one right there.
I was gonna say, we could dive into things. I have my own personal views. They are not encoded, but yeah, different podcast.
For those people who are really into the whole technologies around genetics and genome testing, is, we've also heard a lot around CRISPR, a type of technology. Just curious about how that's different or can be used in conjunction with what you're creating, and what is all of that noise and interest about CRISPR, and how does it relate to Encoded Therapeutics?
Yeah, so CRISPR is one of the different approaches that you can take to gene therapy. And I think one of the things about gene therapy is it's a broad field. And a lot falls under that term. And so you can think of different approaches as like gene replacement. There's gene addition approaches, gene editing, which CRISPR is what you hear about all the time, gene silencing. And what Encoded's approach is right now, at least for our Dravet program, is gene regulation. And so it is a different approach than this CRISPR, this gene editing, but it does fall into that overall umbrella category of gene therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. And, some people who are hearing this for the first time may, when you're not used to something or something feels different, you heard, and especially now with the COVID-19, which was a relatively simple concept, there was all kinds of misconstrued information, and somebody's injecting some kind of sensor in your body and it's going to reduce fertility for young children, and like all this other conspiracy theories. How do you deal with the naysayers, or there are people who are just distrustful of whatever you're saying about their genetics?
Yeah, it's hard. I think one of the important things is you still have to listen. You have to listen to these concerns because they're valid for those individuals. So, listen, but also have open and honest conversations. Be willing to be transparent from a company perspective on what we do and don't know. These are investigational therapies, at least in our case. And so we don't have all the answers, and we don't know all the risks. We anticipate, based on other studies and other products, but we don't know everything. And I think the other important thing is education. Education, it can come in many ways, and you have to figure out the best way to educate certain individuals, because not everybody takes in information the same. And I find with those individuals, kind of how you were talking about, that have these misconceptions, that the vaccine is going to make, them magnetic and they can stick magnets to themselves. I think what's important there too is not only creating the education, but getting the education to the people that those individuals trust, so that they're hearing it from a trusted resource. And so we have to make sure that we're getting this information out to those who are educating others.
Yeah, huge part of it. And education is so absolutely essential, because I think there is a lot of fear around these sorts of things. So with that whole point, if you were actually to predict in 10 to 20 years, do you see the day where genetic or genome testing is done from the time of birth? What would be the advantages or disadvantages of society doing that?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and one a lot of ethicists talk about a lot. In the U.S., we do a lot of newborn screening already, but it's based on a blood prick or heel prick where we get a blood spot and you test there. And we only screen for specific diseases that we know of. So we're not looking at everything. Because our technology and our understanding of a lot of these newborn genetic diseases has really increased the number of disorders we're looking for at birth. But because of that, this is where the question of should we just be doing genetic testing instead? Especially because the price of genetic testing and the ease of it has come down. But the problem, I think what we come up with though, is we're still understanding the genome. We're still learning about which different mutations relate to what do they cause. There's mutations we have no idea what they're related to. And so, you don't want to go to a parent and say, hey, your newborn has this list of mutations, but we don't know what it means. So good luck. We don't know if it's ever going to do anything. And then they live with that and that unknown. So I think that's, there's benefit or those pros and cons, I guess, to that. I think the other piece, and this is something I hear from families, I actually don't know so much about it, but they also worry, what if on this genetic screen for my child, it comes up they have X disease, but or they have a chance of having X disease, or an elevated chance. Then does that mean health insurance can deny them coverage even though they haven't actually had the disease manifest itself yet? There's only a chance that they can have it. And so I think there's other concerns and I just don't know what our new rules are around that, but they're legitimate concerns for people to have.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. The bioethicists and everybody are going to have lots of discussion, especially since we're in a world of cybersecurity issues. As we know, ransomware has become $1 trillion business, and everybody in his brother's databases are getting hacked. And so it is a new world in question of what is privacy and what is security. And this very big, I guess, if you will, thought experiment is, what would it look like if everybody's information was on the blockchain, as an example, and available to everybody? What would that mean? And so it's a really interesting thought experiment. What's your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, from a scientific perspective, it would be amazing. We could learn so much, especially if it's all de-identified. We can go in, we can mine it. We could, information about the individual's health is put in over the years, so we can see, those trends and start making those connections. It would be just open up a world of possibilities, and increase our understanding of that tie of genetics to health. But as you said, there are so many other concerns, privacy concerns. What else can that data be used for? Who's going to get their hands on it? That's why I'm in patient advocacy. I don't do that.
With all of that said, I mean, there are so many diseases that potentially, especially the rare diseases, that can be affiliated with some sort of a genetic variant. I mean, ALS comes to mind as an example, and it's probably many, many others. Many of them are neurodegenerative. Just curious about the future of Encoded. You're kind of starting in this Dravet syndrome in pediatrics, but what's kind of the roadmap and what's the thinking there?
Yeah, so, I can't answer specifics to that, specific other indications we'll go into. But our hope is, this pediatric central nervous system disorders. I think that's a place that we'll stay for a little bit, look at, because we have this AAV9 vector, and we have this way of specifically targeting cells within the brain, so we can be very specific. And there are a host of CNS disorders, especially those that impact the pediatric population. So I think we, as a company, you could just stay there and be successful, and impact millions of lives over the years. But I think the hope for any company is, if you have the right technology and there's a disease out there that we understand enough, and we, enough in that we know that there's potential benefit for our technology to help, that we would go into that. It's always going to take time. You first got to do your preclinical research, and proof of concept, but the hope is we can help as many people as possible. It's just going to take time, and we just got to see what the right opportunities are.
What would be an opportunity for people listening to partner with Encoded Therapeutics? What are the partnership opportunities that exist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for individuals, in the Dravet space, reach out. We love to learn from you, and help us understand how we can support what education materials you do need. We don't want to just create things without knowing if it's needed. So let us know. Ask us questions. We try to be as transparent as possible. So just engage with us. Have those conversations. I think for other stakeholders, it's the same. We want to be able to do this right. We want to work with everybody to do that, because gene therapies are not something somebody can do in a silo. It really does take a community to, one, develop these, but also bring them to patients and their families. I think we already talked about the access piece, and so just developing a gene therapy isn't the holy grail. It's then getting it to the people, and so there's just a host of ways you can work with us. I think what we are, because of our stage of our company, is very research focused, very, let's get this clinical trial stage started. So that education around what that means.
I love it. I think this is probably a great way to tie up the conversation. For anybody who is listening or watching the show today and you're interested in connecting with Jennifer or with Encoded Therapeutics, we will be leaving her contact information. Please reach out. There are so many different ways you can get involved. And even if you wanted to get involved on the controls part of their Endeavor trial, there's always, opportunities like that. So reach out and talk. And also, if you enjoyed this show, we encourage you to check out impetusdigital.com. These are the kinds of conversations that we have both asynchronously and synchronously using our Insight our Insight platform, so that we can bring people like payers, patients, allied healthcare providers, physicians together to drive policy, have discussions, again, everything from website development to educational material, and drive your agenda objectives forward, how you might be able to work with, advocacy groups, working on your technologies, etc. So please check that out. We appreciate if you can like and subscribe to our channel, and we would love if you could leave us a review on our podcast. I want to thank everybody for their time today. Jennifer, this was an outstanding conversation.
Thank you.
And wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.